Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker. So today I'm going to be continuing on with my Shroud solo series. This is going to be the last podcast that I do for my semester. I'm assuming everything goes to plan and I pass my final essay and pass my thesis. Then that's it. I will have graduated from my Master's of Philosophy program at Ryerson. Woohoo, assuming all goes to plan. But you never know. Maybe I'll fail or something like that. But assuming it doesn't, yeah, so this will be the last podcast that I do for the month of April. I want to take a break just to kind of relax because I've been working very hard lately. So after this, I'll take a week off. And then afterwards, something very exciting is happening. So David Russell, the host of Pora, or Proselytize or Apostatize, is teaming up with Tyler Fowler. And they have a new radio show, a totally brand new podcast called Faith Unaltered. And it's also a radio program in front of 25,000 people or something like that, plus their podcast audience. And they're launching this on May 13th and May 14th. They've asked me to help and give a presentation on the Evil God Challenge. I'm going to prepare some PowerPoint slides and have a lecture about the Evil God Challenge, which was the topic of my thesis and that sort of thing. So yeah, look out for that. I'm going to take a week off, and then I'll be doing that show, and I'll post that up for you guys on RSM here. Apart from that, I do have a bunch of guests that I have nothing confirmed, but I do have agreements with them in principle to do a show sometime in May or sometime during the summer, so I'll work those out. But other than that, yeah, I want to start working on slowing down and doing more detailed shows, solo shows on the topics that I wanted to do. When I began Real Seekers, my main goal is I want to take you through my process, how I converted to Christianity. Through my 11 premise, it should be a 10 premise argument. I'll fix it up right now in rough. It's 11 premise argument that led me to faith in Christ back in 2018. And I want to start, with various topics. So I want to do premise one. I want to continue on with my series about God's existence. So next time I want to do an argument from the hiddenness of God. So that's an atheistic argument. Address my take on that. Then I'm going to get into the ontological argument and include two atheistic arguments. One, the incoherence of Christian theism argument, and as well put into that the evil God challenge as well. So that'll be three arguments for the price of one. Some point this summer, I'd like to do a series on near-death experiences and do a little bit on that for you guys. Obviously, I have to finish off part 5 or part 6 of my Jesus Mythicism series, which is where I look at the negative evidences, so evidence or arguments favoring Jesus Mythicism, and then I'll take a bit of a break on that. And of course, I'll be continuing on with my Shroud Wars, hopefully, and Shroud solo series. I want to hopefully get that finished this summer if possible, and that sort of thing. So a lot of things on the horizon. And yeah, like I said, I have a bunch of guests who've agreed to come on in principle. So we'll see. We'll set up those dates and times if they're still willing to come on throughout the course of the spring and summer season. Okay, with that said, that's it in terms of announcements. So with that said, let's get straight into this Shroud solo series. I think it's part 17. And we're going to be this is going to be the last of the minor hypotheses. After this, we're going to be going back to major categories or umbrella categories of ordinary artistic and ordinary naturalistic hypotheses. And also, next time in part 18, when we look at the electrostatic hypotheses, we're going to be looking at our first extraordinary hypothesis or extraordinary mechanism, which you guys kind of heard in the show with Dr. Giulio Fonte, the corona discharge hypothesis. So we'll be looking at that in addition to an ordinary naturalistic version of the electrostatic mechanism. But for this one, we're looking at the last of the minor hypotheses, and this is known as the bacterial or fungal hypothesis mechanism. And this was done by a Shroud skeptic, Dr. Leoncio Garza-Valdes. And he came up with this in the 90s, around 1993 to 1998, after which it's been totally discredited. No Shroud expert in the 21st century agrees with this theory. It's a bit of a joke considered today. But yeah, let's find out what his theory is and why do all the Shroud experts today dismiss this as an option or an explanation for the Shroud's remarkable images. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so what is this theory? Well, it's very simple, very straightforward. Basically, Dr. Garza-Valdes, or Dr. Garza for short in the literature sometimes, he basically suggested, well, look, must have been this bioplastic or clear encasing biocoating. It was invisible to the naked eye. And this was composed of millions of microbiological organisms or bacteria, which over time formed the images, the body images at least. Obviously, this mechanism doesn't explain the Shroud of Turin's bloodstain images at all. The bloodstains are made of blood. They're not made of bacteria or something like that. So obviously, how does he explain the Shroud's bloodstains? He has to assert and assume, oh well, direct contact did this. This is an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis. It's not an artistic mechanism, so there's no painting of blood or whatever. So he assumes, look, direct contact did this. As we saw in our previous shows when we addressed direct contact theories in part 13 and the supplemental of part 13, scientifically impossible, naturalistically speaking, for the bloodstains to be encoded onto the shroud through direct contact alone and to explain all of their minimal relevant features. So we'll just refer to that show in terms of a refutation there. We also refuted in previous shows that the Shroud of Turin's bloodstains couldn't have been painted on. Neither could it have been explained by a hybrid. And those are the only three ordinary artistic or ordinary naturalistic hypotheses one can use to explain the bloodstains. Otherwise, you have to appeal to an extraordinary or supernatural miracle of God to explain those. So yeah, it's an utter failure right there. This theory fails to explain the bloodstains. But yeah, putting that aside, in terms of the body images, like I said, millions of microbiological organisms and bacteria formed the images over time, and this is kind of similar to the formation of a coral reef. So that's what Dr. Garza-Valdes, or Dr. Garza, as I'm going to call him, thinks that the Shroud of Turin body images were formed there. So let's get straight into assessment. How do we assess this? Well, obviously, this as a minor ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, this is one of the worst. It is horrible. It practically fails every single MRF, or minimal relevant feature, in order to explain the Shroud's body image physical and chemical properties. But let's get into this specifically. So let's start with minimal relevant feature number 1. This refers to the body images have the photonegative images or quasi-negative images, whatever helps the Shroud skeptic. There's the Shroud body image high resolution. They're highly resolved images. And also the body image diffuseness. How does this hypothesis work for MRF number 1? So as I said, this is one of the worst mechanism hypotheses that's out there to explain the Shroud from the Shroud skeptics. So in terms of the photographic negativity, does it explain this? Or even quasi-negativity? Nope. Utter failure. My goodness, this is one of the very few theories that totally fails explaining this feature. And think about it. It is very, very improbable. It's scientifically impossible that bacteria or a fungus would just happen to grow and proliferate and miraculously distribute themselves into a highly sophisticated gradient of shading in order to result in the detailed photographic quality image that we see on the Shroud of Turin. This is just impossible, totally unprecedented. Let alone, what about the Shroud's high-resolution feature? Well, it's absurd to think that bacteria would grow or colonize in such a way as to produce high-resolution images of both the frontal and dorsal side images of the Shroud man. Ridiculous, Shroud skeptics. No. Once bacteria is on the cloth, or fungus is on the cloth, they distribute themselves in various directions. You know, they don't correlate specifically to the shape of a body. No, they'll grow out in any and all directions. There'll be no correlation to the shape of a man at all. So it's scientifically impossible, I would say, that we would have the high resolution feature of the Shroud of Turin if the colonization of bacteria or some kind of fungus growing on the Shroud of Turin is responsible for encoding the body images. Utter failure. What about minimal relevant feature number 2? So this is with respect to the body image uniformity. Once again, here on all fronts, we had 4 aspects. Utter failure. It can't explain any of this. You know, the fact that bacteria could form an image with the same uniform body image color intensity Impossible. No, they would be all over the place. There would be various higher and lower concentrations of the bacteria colonizing on the shroud in different locations. We would not get this perfectly uniform on each individual fibril, the exact same color or darkness intensity. Sorry, shroud skeptics, I don't have that much faith. Same deal with the maximum uniform density of color. It's on the frontal and dorsal images, they just happen to have the exact same uniform maximal darkness levels. One's not darker than the other one in terms of the frontal and backside images. Impossible, skeptics. Bacteria are too stupid to plan this. Do you think bacteria are like some kind of brilliant genius with like Albert Einstein's brain or something? No, they'll just grow randomly and colonize wherever they get to do it, and we would expect random distributions. The backside image might be more darker than the frontal image and that sort of thing. Especially if the body is pressed due to gravity, is pressed down on the dorsal image, we would expect more bacteria to proliferate on the dorsal image, and it would be darker. What about substance uniformity, right? So this is an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis. This hypothesis gives me the fact that there's a human body with skin and hair. There's at least those two different substances, maybe more. Do you honestly think that bacterial agents operate uniformly on both skin and hair? No, that's scientifically impossible as well. So utter failure. Finally, this isn't a minimal relevant feature, but what about the cylindrical uniformity, right? So it's uniform around the 360-degree surface of every single fibril. Remember, fibrils have a diameter smaller than that of a human hair. This is a feature that's been, people like Dr. Giulio Fonte have said that they've discovered it's encoded around the 360 degree of each fibril uniformly. So this would be an utter failure here as well. Now, obviously, we're not going to hold the failure of this aspect against the bacterial hypothesis because it's not a minimal relevant feature. There's some controversy among pro-shroud experts as to whether this is a proven fact or not. But just for the sake of argument, if it is a fact, if we do confirm this one day, this hypothesis, utter failure on that front. So yeah, in terms of MRF, or minimal relevant feature number 2, with the 4 aspects of body image uniformity, total failure, throw this in the garbage. Okay, what about minimal relevant feature number 3? The fact that the body images convey topographical or 3-dimensional information. Once again, bacteria would not be able to transfer from the body to the cloth in the non-contact zones. They need contact to encode. Now that's more a part of MRF number 4, but still, with respect to this issue, this causes an issue for the 3-dimensionality of the shroud, because the resultant images would not produce complete 3-dimensional images that are perfect, except for in locations where there's interference, like at the bloodstains. It would be totally unlike what we have with the shroud. Another issue here is that, look, even if the bacteria miraculously somehow was able to transfer to the cloth, even in the non-contact zones, again, they just wouldn't distribute themselves in a way that would produce high-resolution body images, let alone ones that conveyed 3-dimensional data. I'm sorry. Again, how much of a genius, how brilliant are these bacteria that they can do what human beings, modern forensic artists can't even do this with the most help and using latest scientific technology. They fail, but somehow the bacteria are smarter than humans, and they distributed themselves as they colonized the shroud. They just happened to distribute themselves in ways that created high-resolution photographic negative images and the feature of 3-dimensionality as well. If you believe that, okay, very well. I guess I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you then. All right, cool. So let's move on. What about minimal relevant feature number 4? And this relates to several aspects. So there's those continuous full-length body images on both the frontal and dorsal side images. So that, remember what we just said about the non-contact zones. Bacteria it needs direct contact to transfer to the cloth. It can't transfer through the air or something like that. So either you would need to postulate some kind of perfect amount of pressure, thereby forcing all locations to touch all parts of the body equally. That's very improbable in itself, as we saw with direct contact theories. But most importantly, look, whatever encoded the images on the shroud, It's been proven mathematically that they traveled in vertical straight lines or curvilinear lines. And so either curvilinear or rectilinear vertical straight lined creating wrapping distortions on the Shroud of Turin. This method requires direct contact in order for the bacteria to get onto the cloth. And as we saw with Dr. John Jackson, who mathematically proved, this would be a different path. We wouldn't get these vertical projection paths if the cloth was pressed down to touch, say the cheek or the side of the nose or something like that. Impossible for bacteria to account for this feature. Instead, we would get the absorption or path A, as you're seeing on your YouTube screens there. So yeah, it utterly fails to explain for this, as well as probably fails the non-contact zones. Now, in terms of the fact that there's precisely no body side images at all or top of the man's head, that's impossible as well, because any such mechanism that posits, full contact and that sort of thing, these would be touching the body sides, and there would undoubtedly be the same bacteria on the sides of the body too. The fact that the bacteria just happen to be on all the vertically mapped associated body parts and only there, not on the side at all, like the side of the stomach or rib cage or something like that, completely ridiculous. Utter failure, Shroud skeptics. And this is the case even if you go with, maybe remember Ray Rogers in the Maillard reaction. He has that amendment theory where the spice packs were in block form, solid form, and they were at the sides of the bodies, therefore keeping the shroud from touching the sides of the body. Again, remember we saw there, it's dubious. Could they be perfect? That's improbable. Were the spice packs perfectly aligned with the body? That's unlikely, right? If it was higher up, then that would lift the shroud up and you wouldn't get the full length body images. They wouldn't be touching even on the vertical parts. If the spice packs were lower than the body, lying in the spine position, well, that would bring the cloth down and it would inevitably be touching at least part of the body sides. And therefore, bacteria would get onto it and encode partial body side images. And in fact, I should have mentioned this in the Maillard reaction, but we know for a fact from the location of some of the blood stains that we have, for example, the crown of thorns around his head, it's been scientifically proven from that the shroud was indeed, at least at one point, wrapped around the body and the head at some point. So if that's the case in this bacterial hypothesis, well, there would have been bacteria on the sides of his head and that sort of thing, and therefore the bacteria would have transferred to the cloth and created shroud images of the sides of the face or the top of the man's head or stuff like that. You get what I'm saying, the sides of the face or the body sides, because we know scientifically it was wrapped around the head at the very least and the body at some point. Therefore, bacteria would have showed up and produced at least partial side images. So utter failure all around in terms of all the aspects of minimal relevant feature number 4. Okay, what about minimal relevant feature number 5? And this refers to the body image superficiality, non-cementation of the fibers, no evidence of capillary flow between the fibers of the shroud. All right, very simple, utter failure. So on this front, think about it in terms of body image superficiality. Let's just look at that. Assuming that the bacteria did grow horizontally, as this theory says, what the heck is there? There's absolutely nothing that would prevent bacteria from penetrating beyond the superficial layers or the superficial fibrils. Remember, the body image is superficial on the Shroud of Turin, so number one, on a fabric level, it doesn't breach through on a macroscopic level to the reverse side of the cloth. Number 2, they're superficial on a thread level, meaning only the top 2 to 3 fibrils are colored on the Shroud of Turin. It doesn't penetrate beyond 3 fibrils. Remember, each fibril is only about as the diameter of a human hair. That's how minuscule these things are, and only 2 to 3 of these are colored. Utter failure. They'll penetrate past the third. Bacteria will penetrate past the third fibril and go way deep down into the cloth. There's nothing preventing them from growing that way. Why wouldn't they penetrate vertically? What about the body image superficiality on the level of the fibril? Only the primary cell wall, as you saw in the show with Dr. Giulio Fonte, he actually showed visuals of this. Only the primary cell wall is colored, not the entire fibril. So it's superficial, even on the smaller than a human hair. Just the outer surface of that is colored. Bacteria, they'll penetrate beyond that. There's nothing preventing bacteria on this hypothesis from penetrating vertically deeper into the cloth and penetrating beyond just the superficial layer. There should be body images that are non-superficial. Utter failure. All right, cool. So that's it for this. Let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 6. So this deals with the condition of the man in the shroud, anatomical accuracies, as well as the no bloodstain or body the bloodstain, minimal relevant features, as we already said. And then there's no decomposition or putrefaction liquids in sufficient quantity to explain the images. Obviously, in terms of this, no decomposition, putrefaction, I gave it a green check mark. I was generous to the Shroud skeptic. I felt bad about how much this guy's failing, or how much this hypothesis is failing. So let's just give them a green check mark. Pretend the body was somehow removed within a short period of time before decomposition liquids would accumulate on the shroud in sufficient quantities, before decomposition in any significant degree took place. Or maybe it's not a dead body. Maybe it was a human body with a living human body with bacteria on it that created the shroud images. Now, obviously, if you go there, you're in for a world of hurt when we look at the other aspects. When we get to the anatomical accuracies, which includes the fact that the body is clearly in rigor mortis, as evidenced by the body rigidity in certain areas, like the buttocks and that sort of thing. And that's been proven by forensic experts, multiple forensic experts, including some of the world's top forensics and medical scientists all throughout the 20th century. So yeah, obviously, if you posit a living human body, you might avoid that no decomposition thing, but then you're going to run into a world of hurt when it comes to some of the anatomical accuracies, where there is this body rigidity that's evident on the shroud man in certain areas, and this is evidence of rigor mortis and that sort of thing. So yeah, in terms of the anatomical accuracies, as a whole, it's highly unlikely that bacteria would encode body images at all. Remember, they would just distribute and colonize in random directions. Whatever direction they're able to colonize in, that's what they do. Unless they're hindered by some external thing or something. There's a barrier or something like that. But on the shroud, there would have been nothing. They could go any way they want, horizontally or vertically. They would not specifically distribute themselves in a way to correlate to body images. And therefore, you would not get these anatomical accuracies of the shroud. It's amazing that we have anatomical accuracies evident on the shroud man, whereby the world's experts, I'm trying to remember, for some reason I'm blanking on his name, but people like Frederick T. Zugaby, for example, Yves Delage, people of this caliber. There's another guy who was the basis for Quincy Jones. He's one of the main guys as well, and I've totally blanked out on his name. Anyways, but he agreed. He was a major forensic expert as well. So it would just be impossible for bacteria to explain these. In the same way, it's impossible for even an anatomically inaccurate image. It would be impossible for bacteria to create that of a human body as well. So this is just an utter failure. And think about it as well. Those many scourge wounds and marks, how would it create body images? And how would blood, if blood was there, how would that prevent the bacteria from creating body images or colonizing in those areas? It wouldn't. Obviously, that leads into the next aspect, the blood stain and all of their minimal relevant features. And this relies on direct contact. We already evaluated that, and that's made criticisms there, and that's an absolute failure. But there's an additional problem when it comes to encoding the blood stains that's specific to this bacteria hypothesis. And so this is the fact that, look, Dr. Garza-Valdes, he claims that the blood stains have been proven to be approximately 95% bacteria. Huh? But this claim, absolute horse manure. He's lying. He's got zero bupkis proof. This is just a claim from a Shroud skeptic who's biased, obviously, and he has no peer-reviewed literature to back up this claim. The blood stains are composed of blood. You know, I had that show in my Shroud Wars interview with Dr. Kelly Kearse. I call him a Shroud agnostic. He doesn't like that term, but he's one of the world's experts in blood, and he said, no, this is just blood. But yeah, so everyone, literally every scientist in the world, even skeptic, Shroud skeptic or not, Hugh Ferry wouldn't be so foolish as to claim that the bloodstains are 95% bacteria. What's more, regardless of appealing to scholarly consensus, look, this directly contradicts 13, at least 13, there's more now, independent scientific tests, empirical tests that prove, absolute proof, beyond all reasonable doubt, the presence of whole blood and blood exudates on the shroud. The bloodstains are not bacteria. Garza-Valdes is lying. But anyways, again, as I said, regardless of the composition, remember, believe it or not, it's not a minimal relevant feature for me that the shroud's bloodstains are composed of blood. Why isn't it a minimal relevant feature? Well, it's not. We do have absolute proof that it's blood. I'm not denying it. There's no controversy in the evidence or anything like that, scientifically speaking, but I purposely didn't think that it was needed for my argument, for my case. I didn't want to front load it against certain artistic theories that might posit, well, are the bloodstains composed of paint or anything like that? Instead, I just waited until we evaluated the hypotheses, and any hypotheses that posit paint, then I bring in the evidence proving that it's real blood or something like that. So I didn't include the fact that the shroud's bloodstains are composed of actual real blood as a minimal relevant feature, but it definitely qualifies as such. Scientifically speaking, it's beyond all reasonable doubt. This claim by Garza-Valdes is rubbish. And like I said, everyone today would disagree with him. It doesn't matter whether you're atheist, agnostic, Christian, whether you're a shroud skeptic or not, Hugh Ferry, Colin Berry, none of these guys would admit this. And we've got the peer-reviewed science journals, all of them admit, no, this is blood that we have. And we have 13 independent scientific tests confirming the presence of blood. So yeah, they're not bacteria. And even if it was composed of bacteria, it would still be scientifically impossible for bacteria to explain all of the minimal relevant features of the bloodstains. Why are there no body images under the bloodstains? How do you account for the serum retraction rings? Bacteria wouldn't form those. A whole host of things. There's no smearing, no damage or alteration to the bloodstains. It looks exactly as it would as though the blood flowed and congealed on the human skin, as one of our forensic experts, I think Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, has mentioned, and we quoted from him in a previous show. So absolute failure on this front, and shame on Dr. Garza-Valdes for lying to the people about the composition of the bloodstains. I find that despicable. All right, cool. So let's move on to the final minimal relevant feature, number 7. And these are our additional features. And there's only one additional feature that really applies to this, and that's additional feature number 6. That's the fact that microchemical evaluation has proven that there's no evidence of any spices, oils, nor any other biochemical or organic substance known to be produced by or associated with a human body, either in life or in death. So absolute failure here, right? The credible STURP scientists have thoroughly examined the shroud. During the 1978 investigation, they found no signs of an extensive amount of bacteria or fungi present in the body image areas or anywhere else on the shroud. And this would be required for the hypothesis to be true. The bacteria wouldn't be, you can't appeal to like the other shroud skeptics. Well, somehow they all oxidized or left the shroud or something like that. Yeah, that wouldn't be, that wouldn't work in terms of the bacteria hypothesis. There is one, being fair to the shroud skeptic, there is one thing I should admit here is there were minor contaminants of bacteria that have been found in isolated areas along various other contamination particles on the shroud. So there have been some isolated contamination particles that obviously have been found on the shroud. We discussed this in detail in terms of what they found. You know, they found like insect parts. They found pink nylon and a modern felt tip pen mark and stuff like that. So there are contamination things, but it's been scientifically proven they're in isolated areas. They have nothing to do with the body images and the formation of the body images. And we should be able, if the bacteria hypothesis is true, we would detect sufficient amounts of bacteria creating the shroud in the body image areas specifically. We don't find that. So this is just falsified. Additionally here, look, 34 samples from various locations on the shroud were examined by FTIR, the Fourier Transform Infrared Microspectrophotometry. That's a bit of a mouthful. But this device, and none of these samples revealed the existence of a bioplastic coating, which is what this theory dictates has to be present on the shroud. So it's different than Ray Rogers. At least with Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction, he posits, there is this superficial layer, a starch layer or sugar layer that reacted chemically with the gases of a body or something like that. Well, at least they found certain starch impurities. They haven't found the entire starch layer, but in certain areas of the shroud, they found starch impurities. At least that's an empirical data point. Whether you go on to postulate, those isolated starch impurities, that proves that there was an entire superficial layer of it on the shroud. That's going beyond the data. But at least you have that data point. In this place, you don't even have the data point to get started here. None of these samples showed these bacteria to be present anywhere on the shroud. This bioplastic coating, non-existent. Not even traces or little bits of data that you can use to say, well, maybe there used to be a bioplastic coating and speculate on that front like Ray Rogers does with his starch layer. You can't even do that. Utter failure. Lastly, look, bacteria are living organisms, right? So that means that the bacteria would need to produce certain substances. They would need to excrete. But once again, there have been no traces. They need to eat and get rid of the waste, right? There have been no traces of any of these types of substances detected anywhere, either on the image areas of the shroud or on the non-image bearing fibrils of the shroud either. So once again, utter failure. It's just scientifically impossible that this hypothesis would be true. One thing I'll say with this last point, just before we go, obviously that this last point assumes that the bacteria feed only on air as opposed to the linen itself. And this is why we would expect the excrement to have accumulated over the centuries. So this problem doesn't necessarily apply for all forms of bacteria, which could be postulated under this type of mechanism. So I do want to be honest about that kind of qualification. But look, even if we do assume in favor of the shroud skeptic here and say, well, the bacteria that formed the shroud's images were the type that didn't feed only on air, they also fed on the linen itself, and therefore they removed the traces of their crap, their excrement, or whatever you want to say. And that's why we don't detect it there over the centuries. Even if we grant this, it would still be entirely ad hoc, very ad hoc, to assume that all such traces of this excrement from the bacteria would have been consumed entirely, including the most recent ones, the ones that were most recent as of 1978 when they searched for with these scientific equipment, searched for it. No, you would have at least certain detectable traces. Was that the case? Nope. Zip, doodah, bubkiss. No bacteria crap anywhere on the Shroud of Turin. That's scientifically impossible to be the case. So even if we grant everything to these shroud skeptics and say, it's a special type of bacteria that doesn't just feed on the air, they also eat the linen, and that means they consume and get rid of the evidence for their waste. Nonetheless, we would still expect there to be some evidence of their waste on the shroud, especially the ones that were produced most recently. Nothing on the Shroud of Turin. So this is an utter failure. All right, cool. So that's it in terms of the minimal relevant features. That's our assessment. Let's get into our cumulative case considerations and conclusion. In terms of the best explanation inference criteria, how does the bacterial or fungal hypothesis perform? So our first criteria here is in terms of plausibility. Is this a plausible hypothesis? Okay, so first and foremost, in terms of the theoretical implausibility of this mechanism, as I've kind of hinted at before, look, the behavior of the bacteria as posited under this theory is totally contradictory to everything known science has shown about how bacteria and other microorganisms grow and colonize. And this is based on decades of detailed scientific studies. Absolute failure here. This is totally implausible, and it's contradictory to everything we know about bacteria. It's just impossible for it to exist. Once again, it's just highly implausible that bacteria would be able to produce the highly resolved, anatomically correct images on the shroud that encapsulate three-dimensional information and produce in correspondence with vertically mapped encodation paths.
That's impossible based on everything we know from scientific studies about bacteria. Secondly, there's also an issue here. It's very implausible that bacteria would even be able to populate on the Shroud of Turin in the first place. It's based on the textile itself. So let me quote a textile expert, one of the world's experts here, Dr. John Tyre. And he mentioned, quote unquote, flax, when bleached, as it is in the case of the Shroud of Turin, has a high resistance to bacteriological attack, so long as it is kept dry. So it's not even possible that the bacteria would grow on the Shroud of Turin as a textile. The cloth itself is resistant to the growth of bacteria here. Finally, there's another theoretical implausibility here. Even if we grant, being generous to the Shroud skeptic here, as generous as we can, to the point of stupidity. But let's just grant all of this. Let's suppose that there was an extensive amount of bacteria that did exist somehow on the Shroud, miraculously got there, and was therefore able to produce the body images as we see them. Even still, the Shroud would consequently be so brittle that it would shatter if dropped. This is a scientifically proven fact. But in reality, what do we find with the Shroud of Turin? Well, as a textile, it is remarkably flexible for an artifact that is centuries old. Even if it dated to the medieval period, it would be scientifically impossible for this hypothesis to work. The bacteria could not have formed the images. The Shroud would be so brittle, it would just be destroyed if dropped. It would not be flexible. And the Shroud is remarkably flexible as a textile. Even regardless of whether it's 2,000 years old or a medieval textile, it's too flexible for what it should be. And it's just impossible if you're positing, it's way, way too flexible if you're positing the bacteria hypothesis here. But just remember that flexibility of the textile, this is another point in favor of the radiation hypothesis. And we'll get to that in a future show when we discuss the radiation hypotheses. This is just another point outside of the MRFs that supports the pro-Shroud Christian experts saying this is a miracle of God. For our sake right now, the main thing is, in terms of the bacteria hypothesis, the flexibility of the Shroud and the fact that it's not brittle and doesn't get destroyed instantly if you drop it and shattered, that disproves and makes this highly implausible that this theory accounts for the Shroud's images. What about practical implausibility? Well, once again, look, this hypothesis is practically impossible to account for the Shroud's images, because look, we've had many Shrouds having wrapped sweaty bodies covered in bacteria over the millennia. None of them have been able to produce the Shroud's features. Remember, we've done extensive field and lab experiments testing out direct contact with human bodies that are sweaty and that have the same bacteria posited on under this theory to explain the Shroud's images. Shroud of Turin, totally unique. It just doesn't work. So absolute failure here, Shroud skeptics. Pathetic, throw this theory in the garbage. There is just nothing analogous in human history. Despite this ample, sufficient opportunity from artificial field and lab experiments, not only the natural opportunity for these images to be duplicated either in part or as a whole due to the bacteria on a sweaty human body. Just doesn't happen. Sorry, guys. All right, let's move on. What about explanatory scope? Okay, so with respect to explanatory scope, this theory doesn't even attempt to account for the vertically mapped wrapping distortions at all that are present on the Shroud. It just completely fails to account for various Shroud image aspects. It just fails to have explanatory scope. And like I said, it doesn't even try to account for the Shroud's bloodstains. So being generous to the Shroud skeptic will just say, oh, he's probably just assuming that direct contact can do it. So utter failure on explanatory scope. And like I said, it's very telling that this theory doesn't even seem to account for a scientifically proven fact about the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Explanatory power. So there, as we saw in our analysis of the minimal relevant features, there are pretty much all of the features with very few exceptions, maybe one or two to three exceptions where it does get a green check mark. It is extremely hard to accept this account as having the power to explain pretty much all of the minimal relevant features. Just expecting bacteria to grow superficially while encoding high-resolution three-dimensional images in a strictly vertically mapped process or encodation path, that's not just very, very unlikely. That's scientifically impossible. Let's be honest, skeptics. Additionally, the failure of this method to account for the total absence of bacteria and or their excretions, the bacteria crap, as would be expected if this theory were true, this just makes it virtually impossible to accept this as a valid image-forming mechanism, and it therefore fails to have explanatory power. Finally, we have the less ad hoc criterion. How many non-evidenced assumptions does this hypothesis employ? Well, this theory, believe it or not, employs multiple non-evidenced assumptions, mostly in regard to how the alleged bacteria on the shroud would have behaved in ways that are totally unprecedented in all of our decades of scientific research, proving that bacteria or fungus do not grow. Microorganisms simply do not grow in the way postulated in order for this mechanism to explain the shroud's images. Number one, it assumes, look, bacteria would have grown horizontally but not vertically. Yeah, right, shroud skeptics. Don't believe you. Two, that sufficient contact was between the cloth and all the areas of the body in order to allow the bacteria to create the non-contact zones in the full continuous length frontal and dorsal images. Three, it assumes that bacteria were present equally on the skin and the hair in order to encode that body image uniformity, substance uniformity. Yeah, right, shroud skeptics. Don't believe you. And four, look, it also assumes all traces of the bacteria and their excrement have completely disappeared from the shroud over time, including the crap that was just recent as of 1978. The bacteria, they wouldn't have, we're going to stop eating and going to the producing waste for a century, and then we eat up the remaining stuff, and that's why you didn't detect it. No, they'll be doing their thing the day of the 1978 testing. It would have been detected. Impossible for there to be zero evidence of the bacteria and or their waste. Sorry, skeptics, don't believe you. These are just way too many absurd assumptions, and because of this, I usually treat the less ad hoc criterion as more of just a tiebreaker, but in this case, just the nature of these non-evidenced assumptions, the quantity and the sheer stupidity and going against everything we know, I think it's a failure here. So I put a failure on the less ad hoc criterion. And therefore, this theory scientifically falsified. It's false. It's, in fact, impossible that the bacteria hypothesis is true for explaining the Shroud of Turin's body and bloodstain images. Utter failure, skeptics. Let's hope you do better next time. All right, cool. So that's it for the bacteria hypothesis. I hope you enjoyed this. Next time, hopefully sometime in May, if not June for sure, I will continue on with this Shroud solo series, and we'll get back into some major categories of explanation, umbrella category mechanisms. And this is going to be the electrostatic hypotheses or mechanisms. So this will include, you heard on my last Shroud Wars with Dr. Giulio Fonte, Bob Rucker, and Bob Siefker, Giulio Fonte used to argue for the corona discharge hypothesis. He's now abandoned that and said that it fails. We'll get into some of his reasons why on the next show, and or you can listen to him personally explain why he doesn't believe in it on my last Shroud Wars show with him in it. We'll go over the corona discharge hypothesis, and this is our first extraordinary mechanism. So this is not an ordinary naturalistic or an ordinary artistic mechanism. If the corona discharge hypothesis is true, bada boom, bada bing, a miracle of God has happened. This is a God-designed event, and it proves Christianity's true. So if you're a Christian listening, you'll want to be cheering for the corona discharge, perhaps. If it works, we've just proven a miracle of God, a God-designed event designed to authenticate the Christian religion. Obviously, we know in advance it's not going to work. Even Dr. Giulio Fanti himself has now abandoned this, but we'll get into the details of this. How does it go in terms of the minimal relevant features? And then secondly, we also have a low energy alternative, and this is an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis by Shroud skeptics, Dr. Dan Spicer and E.T. Totten. It's called the electric charge separation mechanism. So those are the two hypotheses or mechanisms under the electrostatic umbrella category that we're going to be looking at next time. And obviously, obviously other radiation, extraordinary mechanisms like radiation hypotheses from people like Bob Rucker. Bear in mind, perhaps use as a part of a partial explanation the corona discharge or some kind of electrostatic mechanism as a partial explanation in addition to radiation and other things going on. But what we're doing next time is just these electrostatic mechanisms alone without any additional help. And I might throw in as well the divine photography hypothesis, because Dr. Giulio Fanti, this is his new hypothesis. It incorporates the corona discharge again as a partial explanation. So I'll probably throw in the divine photography hypothesis as an update to this section. So look out for that next time, and have a great week. All right, so just one little addendum here before we go. I just wanted to mention, so obviously I've been hard calling Dr. Garza-Valdes a Shroud skeptic and that sort of thing. Obviously, from a certain perspective, he is definitely pro-Shroud. He's one of these credible stirp scientist type deal, right? So he definitely believes that the Shroud of Turin dates the time of Jesus and that sort of thing and was authentic. He's even written a book, I'll link to that, called The DNA of God. So I don't want you to think, oh, Dr. Garza-Valdes is one of these atheist types or something. It doesn't matter whether he's atheist or Christian or whatever, but he's not one of these like Shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry or Colin Barry who just think the Shroud's a total medieval fake. No, he thinks that the Shroud's authentic to the time of Jesus, but still he's giving an ordinary naturalistic explanation. So in that sense, he's a Shroud skeptic in the same way my friends like Barry Schwartz are and that sort of thing, or Ray Rogers and that. Now, that said, one thing I totally forgot. What about the criterion of illumination as a best explanation inference criterion? This is a bonus criterion, and I want to say that it fails. It's a neutral grading on illumination, but one thing that could have made it positive was that Dr. Garza-Valdes applied his bioplastic coating through bacteria as an explanation for the 1988 carbon-14 dating. So this is one of the four, if you remember in part one, I covered four explanations that explain why the 1988 carbon-14 dating was wrong. And the first of these that came out was Dr. Garza-Valdes type's notion of ordinary contamination. And he kind of discovered, well, bioplastic coating produced by bacteria can affect the carbon-14 results that we get. And he's said that, well, maybe this is why the Shroud of Turin came out dated wrongly. In addition, the other explanations, remember Dr. John Jackson, there's that carbon monoxide extraordinary contamination hypothesis. We have Bob Rucker's extraordinary contamination from neutron flux or neutron absorption hypothesis. And then there's people like Joe Marino and Barry Schwartz who go for the invisible reweave hypothesis as an ordinary contamination hypothesis there. But anyways, this is one of the first. So Garza-Valdes goes for the ordinary contamination by a bacteria producing an organic or bioplastic coating, and this threw off the carbon-14 dating. Now, as we saw, this theory has been scientifically falsified. In my opinion, it's scientifically impossible for this, at least for this alone, to explain why the Shroud's carbon-14 date came out to the medieval ages. You would have to have so much bacteria, it would be like double the weight. And again, it would be so brittle that the Shroud would be shattered if you dropped it. It wouldn't be flexible. So this is why basically all Shroud experts, pro and Shroud skeptic alike, dismiss this bioplastic coating hypothesis as an explanation for the images, but also as an explanation for the carbon-14 dating. This type of ordinary contamination just cannot explain it. But I wanted, under the criterion of illumination, I wanted to just mentioned that this has a possible application. Dr. Garza-Valdes applied this to try and explain the 1988 erroneous carbon-14 dating the shroud to the medieval times, and he said no, it dates to the time of Jesus. How did that get screwed up? Well, it was because of this bioplastic organic coating produced by the bacteria that threw off the results. Unfortunately, subsequent to that, we've scientifically falsified this. This explanation does not work to explain the Shroud of Turin's, at the very least, as a full explanation for the Shroud of Turin's 1988 carbon-14